You are not just tired. That is the lie people live inside for years. They call it burnout. They call it low energy. They call it a lack of motivation. But very often, what they are really feeling is something far more painful than tiredness. It is the weight of living without a clear inner direction. It is the slow drain that comes from waking up, moving through the day, doing what is required, and still feeling that something essential is missing from the way life is being lived. There is a special kind of exhaustion that does not come from honest effort. It comes from misalignment, from using strength in the wrong places, from pouring attention into things that do not build anything real, from carrying the private knowledge that there is more in you, but not organizing life in a way that allows that more to become visible. That is why some people can work long hours and still feel alive, while others do far less and feel depleted all the time. The difference is not always effort. Sometimes the difference is aim. One person is moving toward something that feels inwardly true. The other is spending energy without direction, and energy without direction becomes friction. It becomes heaviness. It becomes a life that feels strangely difficult before the real work has even begun. And this is where people start misunderstanding themselves. They assume the problem is that they need more rest, more inspiration, more confidence, more motivation. Sometimes they do need rest, but often rest is being asked to solve a problem that belongs to meaning. You cannot recover deeply from a life that keeps scattering your force. You cannot feel strong for long while living in ways that quietly weaken your respect for yourself. A lot of people are not exhausted because life is demanding too much. They are exhausted because they are divided. One part of them wants comfort, distraction, and emotional ease. Another part knows they are wasting time, shrinking their standards, and drifting away from the person they could become. That inner split is expensive. It drains more energy than work itself, because now every day carries hidden resistance. Not just resistance to tasks, but resistance to seeing clearly. When a person has no clear inner aim, almost everything begins to feel heavier than it is. Simple effort feels oppressive. Small discipline feels unfair. Necessary repetition feels unbearable, not because the actions are impossible, but because the mind cannot connect them to a compelling direction. And when direction is absent, comfort starts to feel smarter than effort. Delay starts to feel harmless. A vague life begins to produce a vague kind of suffering. This is the first truth you have to face. The problem may not be fatigue. The problem may be that life is not being built around something clear enough, honest enough, or meaningful enough to organize the self. And when that happens, even potential begins to feel like a burden. Because deep down, potential is painful when it remains unused. It starts as possibility, but over time, it turns into accusation. So before talking about discipline, productivity, ambition, or change, the real question is simpler and harder. What is life actually pointed toward? What is all this effort serving? What is being built? Because a person can stay busy for years and still remain inwardly directionless. And that kind of life creates a quiet despair that people often mistake for ordinary adulthood. Once that happens, something else enters the picture: comfort. Not dramatic comfort, not luxury, just the ordinary forms of relief that slowly become a substitute for a real life. A little more delay, a little more avoidance, a little more unnecessary ease, a little more negotiation with things that should have been done cleanly the first time. That is how the future starts getting destroyed. Not through one catastrophic decision, but through 1,000 small permissions. Life is rarely wasted in one obvious collapse. It is more often wasted in a pattern so ordinary that it escapes judgment. Staying where you are because movement would be uncomfortable. Repeating habits that numb you because clarity would ask something from you. Choosing what feels easy in the moment, even when you know it keeps you weak. This is how people slowly build a life they never consciously chose. Not through evil, not through stupidity, through softness that went unchallenged for too long. Comfort is dangerous because it rarely introduces itself as danger. It arrives as relief, as reward, as harmless delay, as the belief that there will still be time tomorrow, next week, next year. It does not look like destruction while it is happening. It looks like a break, like a pause, like something small. But repeated comfort has a cumulative effect. It trains the mind to avoid friction. It lowers tolerance for difficulty. It makes effort feel more hostile than it really is. And eventually, the person is no longer choosing comfort. They are obeying it. This is the part people do not like to admit. The comfortable life is often not peaceful. It is anxious, because somewhere underneath the ease is a constant awareness that important things are not being faced. The body is resting, but the conscience is not. The day looks manageable from the outside, but inwardly there is a subtle erosion. Something is being traded away. Depth is being traded for convenience. Growth is being traded for mood. Future strength is being traded for present relief. And because the trade is small each time, it feels survivable. That is why it continues. One ignored task seems minor, one delayed conversation seems understandable, one night of escape seems deserved, one more week of indecision seems forgivable, and in isolation, maybe each one is. But life is not shaped by isolated moments, it is shaped by repeated allowances, by the standards you keep returning to when no one is watching, by what you repeatedly permit yourself to become. This is why comfort can quietly destroy a future while allowing a person to still appear functional. They still go to work, they still answer messages, they still make plans, they still talk about what they want to do. But the deeper architecture of character is weakening. The ability to endure friction is shrinking. The willingness to do hard, necessary, identity-building work is being replaced by a preference for ease. And when ease becomes the organizing principle of life, potential has nowhere serious to grow. A strong life cannot be built on constant emotional negotiation. There are things that must be done whether the mood is present or not. There are seasons that demand discomfort. There are changes that only begin once comfort loses its moral authority over you. Until then, a person may stay intelligent, gifted, self-aware, even ambitious in theory, while still remaining fundamentally unformed. And once comfort has trained you to avoid friction, procrastination starts to look almost reasonable. That is why delay is so deceptive. It does not always feel like weakness. It often feels like caution, patience, preparation, or waiting for the right moment. But much of the time, procrastination is fear that has learned how to speak in a more sophisticated voice. It says, "Not yet." It says, "Tomorrow will be better." It says, "Think a little more first." It says, "Get clearer before you begin." It says, "Maybe later when you feel more ready, more focused, more certain, more equipped." And because these thoughts sound intelligent, people mistake them for wisdom. But often they are just fear trying to avoid exposure. Because the truth is, beginning something meaningful is threatening, not only because it requires effort, but because it removes fantasy. As long as something remains unstarted, it can remain perfect in the imagination. Your talent can remain impressive. Your future can remain grand. Your self-image can remain protected. But the moment you begin, reality enters. Difficulty enters. Your current level becomes visible. The gap between what you imagined and what you can actually do becomes impossible to hide from. That is what procrastination protects people from, not just work. Revelation. Delay is often a strategy for avoiding a painful confrontation with the self. If I do not begin, I do not have to discover how undisciplined I have become. If I do not commit, I do not have to face how inconsistent I really am. If I keep planning, thinking, researching, preparing, organizing and rearranging, I can continue feeling psychologically involved without risking a real encounter with my current limits. This is why procrastination can exist even in intelligent, ambitious, highly self-aware people, sometimes especially there, because the more attached a person is to being capable, the more threatening it becomes to produce imperfect work, take clumsy action, or move before confidence arrives. So they wait. And while they wait, they tell themselves a story that protects their pride. The story says the problem is timing, or energy, or clarity, or circumstances. But underneath that story there is often something much simpler. Fear of friction, fear of inadequacy, fear of becoming ordinary under the pressure of reality. And that fear is expensive, because every delayed act does more than postpone progress. It teaches the self something. It teaches that discomfort is to be avoided. It teaches that uncertainty is a stop sign. It teaches that inner resistance should be obeyed rather than crossed. And over time, that creates a person who trusts hesitation more than action. That is a dangerous identity. Because now life is no longer being shaped by values or vision, but by avoidance. And avoidance is never neutral. It always extracts a price in strength, in confidence, in depth, in self-respect. The tragedy is that the person usually still believes they are preserving potential while they delay, but that is not what is happening. They are weakening the very muscles required to turn potential into reality. The capacity to begin, the capacity to endure imperfection, the capacity to remain in the work long enough for real ability to emerge. None of that grows through delay. It grows through contact, through friction, through repeated exposure to the very thing the mind wants to postpone. So the question is no longer whether procrastination is present. For almost everyone, it is. The real question is what role it is playing. Is it simple poor habit, or is it a defense mechanism protecting the ego from reality? Is it laziness, or is it fear with better language? That question matters, because once the problem is named correctly, the excuse loses some of its power. And this is where you have to become unsentimental, not cruel, clear, because a life can be wasted while still feeling emotionally understandable. That is what makes waste so dangerous. It often has a perfectly reasonable explanation in the moment. You were tired, you were uncertain, you were overwhelmed, you needed a break. You wanted to think more. You were waiting for the right condition. Maybe all of that is true. But a reasonable explanation is not the same thing as a worthy way to live. And the longer that confusion remains, the easier it becomes to spend years inside patterns that feel justified while quietly keeping life small. The deeper confrontation begins when you stop asking, "Why am I not motivated?" and start asking, "What am I protecting myself from by staying this way?" That is a much more dangerous question, because it leads straight into the illusion almost everyone wants to keep. This comforting belief that potential by itself still means something. One of the most seductive lies a person can live inside is the belief that potential by itself is something noble. It sounds noble. It even feels noble. To believe there is something more inside you, to feel that you were meant for more, to carry the sense that under the distraction, under the inconsistency, under the delays, there is still a stronger mind, a sharper discipline, a deeper life waiting to emerge. And that may be true, but potential has a dark side that people do not like to talk about, because potential, when left untested for too long, stops being a gift and becomes a hiding place. It becomes a beautiful internal story that protects you from the harder truth, that what has not entered action has not yet earned reality. This is where many intelligent people get trapped. They start respecting what they could be more than what they are actually doing. They become emotionally attached to the image of themselves in the future. The disciplined version, the focused version, the version that finally commits, finally builds, finally becomes serious. And because that image is so vivid, so flattering, so psychologically comforting, they begin living off it. Not in reality, but in imagination. That is more dangerous than open failure. Failure at least gives you contact with truth. It gives you something solid. It shows you your level. It shows you where you are weak, where you are sloppy, where you are stronger than you thought, where you need repetition, where you need humility. Failure is painful, but it is concrete. Fantasy is painless, but it keeps you floating above your own life. This is why untested potential can quietly become a pleasant form of self-deception. You tell yourself you are capable, and maybe you are, but capable of what exactly? Under what pressure? With what consistency? For how long? In what conditions? Against what resistance? It is very easy to admire your potential when it has never been forced to survive difficulty. A talent that never enters structure remains fragile. A gift that never meets discipline stays unreliable. A strong inner sense of possibility means very little if it disappears the moment reality becomes repetitive, inconvenient, or humbling. That is the part people resist because it sounds harsh. But it is not harsh, it is clean. Reality is where self-respect becomes possible, because only in reality can something be proven, strengthened, corrected, and deepened. Only in reality can vague ability become actual character. Until then, what looks like faith in yourself may just be attachment to a flattering, unfinished identity. And unfinished identities are comforting because they cannot yet be disproven. As long as the book is not written, it can still be brilliant. As long as the work has not begun, the talent can still feel rare. As long as the discipline has not been tested, the future self can remain impressive in the imagination. But the moment action begins, imagination loses some of its power. Reality becomes the judge, and many people would rather protect the dream than submit it to a process that might expose how undeveloped they really are. That is why some people stay in preparation for years, not because they are serious, but because preparation lets them feel close to transformation without enduring the cost of it. They read, think, plan, organize, analyze, restart, refine, wait. They stay near the fire without stepping into it. And because all of this can look responsible from the outside, they do not always realize that they are postponing the one thing that would force their life to become real. Action. Not dramatic action, not cinematic reinvention, just the honest movement that breaks fantasy and introduces contact, repetition, friction, embarrassing first attempts, uneven effort, imperfect consistency, the ordinary, unglamorous conditions under which a human being is actually built. That is where potential either grows up or collapses. And if that sounds disappointing, it is only because fantasy always feels cleaner than practice. The imagined self has no messy middle, no awkward beginning, no evidence of limitation, but real growth is full of all of that. It is slower, less elegant, less emotionally flattering. It asks you to become someone before you feel like someone, which brings you to another lie that wastes years. The idea that readiness is something you find. People wait for readiness the way they wait for permission. They imagine there will be a day when the fear is lower, the mind is clearer, the confidence is stronger, the conditions are smoother, and the stronger version of themselves finally arrives and says, now you are prepared. Now you can begin. Now you can trust yourself. But that day by itself does not come. Readiness is not discovered like a hidden object. It is produced through movement. It is built in contact with the very things that make you feel unready. This is what people do not want to hear when they are stuck, because the mind loves the fantasy of internal completion before external action. It wants certainty first. It wants emotional agreement first. It wants the feeling of strength before the behavior of strength. But life almost never works that way. Confidence usually comes after contact. Clarity comes after beginning. Endurance comes after repetition. The stronger self is usually the result, not the prerequisite. That matters because waiting to feel ready is one of the cleanest ways to remain unchanged while sounding reasonable. You can justify almost any delay by calling it preparation. You can postpone almost any necessary step by telling yourself you need more time, more clarity, more confidence, more healing, more energy, more stability. Sometimes those things are real, sometimes a pause is wise. But often, that language is being used to protect a person from the unsettling truth that action must start before comfort arrives. You do not become ready and then act. Very often you act and become ready in the process. That is how real people are built. Not by feeling complete, but by moving while incomplete. Not by eliminating uncertainty, but by learning to function inside it. Not by waiting for a perfect internal state, but by refusing to make your moods the authority over your future. Because the dangerous habit is not just delay, it is giving your current feelings too much power over what your life becomes. Today you feel uncertain, so you wait. Tomorrow you feel distracted, so you wait. Next week you feel overwhelmed, so you wait. Then life slowly becomes a negotiation with inner weather. And a person who keeps negotiating with moods never develops the steadiness required for meaningful work. At some point, a harder truth has to be accepted. Your future cannot remain dependent on your temporary emotional state. That does not mean becoming cold. It means becoming solid. It means understanding that emotional reluctance is not a verdict. Fear is not a prophecy. Uncertainty is not an instruction. And discomfort is not always a warning. Very often it is simply the cost of crossing from imagination into reality. The people who eventually change are rarely the ones who felt the most ready. They are the ones who became tired of obeying hesitation. They stopped treating reluctance like wisdom. They stopped waiting for an internal ceremony that never came. They moved before the self-image was finished. They moved before the confidence felt complete. They moved while still carrying doubt. And because they moved, something started to change. Not instantly, not beautifully, but honestly. This is where life begins dividing people in a way that is quiet but severe. Not between talented and untalented, not between gifted and ordinary, but between those who keep waiting for a state that will never arrive, and those who let action educate them into the next version of themselves. That difference becomes a life, because every time you move before you feel fully ready, you teach yourself something powerful. You teach yourself that hesitation is survivable. You teach yourself that fear does not deserve automatic obedience. You teach yourself that action can exist before confidence. And over time, that changes the relationship between you and your own mind. You stop seeing resistance as a wall and start seeing it as a threshold. That is when growth stops being theoretical. But there is a deeper wound under all of this, and it is more personal than lack of discipline, more private than procrastination, and more corrosive than simple distraction. It is the experience of quietly abandoning yourself. Because self-betrayal rarely looks dramatic while it is happening. It does not usually arrive in one catastrophic decision. It arrives in small moments that barely seem worth naming. You know what needs to be done, and you step away from it. You know a standard has been lowered, and you allow it. You know you are avoiding something important, and you help yourself look away. You tell yourself it is not that serious. You will fix it tomorrow. You are just tired. You are just off for a few days. You need a reset. You need a better week. You need to get your head right first. Again, sometimes that is true, but sometimes you are watching yourself retreat in real time and calling it something softer so you do not have to feel the full sting of it. This is how self-respect erodes, not only through failure, but through conscious retreat from what you know is required. There is a special kind of pain in that, because when you fail honestly, you can still respect the attempt. But when you betray your own deeper knowledge, when you know and still turn away, something inside you registers it. Maybe not loudly, maybe not all at once, but it registers it. And that is why so many people feel disappointed in themselves, even when their life looks mostly fine from the outside. The disappointment is not always about results. Sometimes it is about private evidence. Evidence collected in moments no one else sees, the conversation avoided, the discipline broken, the standard lowered, the promise to yourself quietly abandoned, the important thing delayed one more time, not because it was impossible, but because retreat felt easier. That private evidence shapes identity more than public performance does. Because deep down, you do not only live by what other people think of you, you also live by what you know about yourself. You know when the effort was real. You know when the excuse was convenient. You know when you were overwhelmed and when you were simply unwilling. You know when life was genuinely hard and when comfort had too much authority again. And over time, that inner record becomes heavy. People often talk about self-confidence as if it comes from positive thinking, from affirmation, from changing beliefs. But much of real confidence comes from something less glamorous. It comes from evidence that you do not keep abandoning yourself when things become uncomfortable. It comes from knowing that when a hard moment arrives, you are not always for sale to ease, mood, and avoidance. This is why self-betrayal is so destructive. It does not just delay progress, it damages trust. And once trust in yourself weakens, everything becomes harder. Decisions become less clean, promises feel lighter, ambitions lose force. The future starts sounding less believable because the person hearing those ambitions is you, and you already know how many times you have said serious things and then disappeared when seriousness was required. That is brutal, but it is also useful, because once the wound is named correctly, the repair becomes clearer. The answer is not self-hatred. It is not dramatic guilt. It is not building a new fantasy identity and trying to worship it. The answer is to stop creating evidence against yourself. That is where repair begins, in small, clean acts, in doing what you said you would do, especially when no one is watching. In refusing tiny retreats that would have passed unnoticed a month ago, in rebuilding internal credibility through behavior, not emotion, in becoming a person whose private actions no longer keep contradicting the life they claim to want. And once that process begins, something else becomes impossible to ignore. The environment of modern life is built to make that depth difficult. Not just through laziness or fear, but through a constant stream of noise that keeps the mind shallow, restless, and easy to pull away from itself. It is very hard to build a deep life in a shallow mental environment. That is one of the quiet disasters of modern distraction. It does not only steal time. People say that all the time, and it is true, but it is not the deepest truth. What distraction really steals is depth. The ability to stay with a thought long enough for it to become insight. The ability to remain with difficulty long enough for it to become strength. The ability to work, reflect, create, and endure without constantly needing escape. A distracted mind does not only do less, it becomes less capable of seriousness. That is the danger. Because when attention is repeatedly broken, something inside you begins to change shape. Your relationship with boredom changes. Your tolerance for slowness weakens. Your ability to stay in one lane long enough to discover what is beneath the surface starts collapsing. And without noticing it, you begin living closer and closer to the surface of yourself. That is why distraction is not a small lifestyle issue. It is a character issue. It trains the mind to resist depth. It teaches you to move away from effort the moment effort stops being stimulating. It makes stillness feel unnatural. It makes focus feel harsh. It makes ordinary sustained work feel almost offensive. And then people wonder why they cannot build anything meaningful. Meaningful things require return. Return to the page, return to the craft, return to the plan, return to the difficult conversation, return to the unfinished problem, return to the self, again and again. not because it is always exciting, but because seriousness is made of repeated contact. A scattered life can produce activity, even urgency, but it rarely produces substance. And that is where many people get fooled. They do not think of themselves as distracted because they are always doing something. They are consuming, answering, planning, checking, scrolling, reacting, switching, searching, organizing, watching, saving, comparing. The day feels full. The mind feels occupied. But fullness is not depth. Occupation is not progress. Constant mental movement can hide a complete absence of inner direction. A person can be busy all day and still spend that whole day being pulled rather than choosing. That difference matters, because when your attention is always available to whatever arrives next, your inner life becomes porous. Everything enters. Every notification, every message, every mood, every impulse, every small curiosity, every emotional disturbance. And once that becomes normal, concentration begins to feel like deprivation. You start feeling that you are missing something by staying with one thing. But what you are actually missing is the ability to become someone who can hold their own mind still long enough to build a real life. That ability is now rare. Which means it is powerful, not glamorous, not loud, powerful. Because the person who can stay with what matters, even when it becomes repetitive, inconvenient, or emotionally flat, has an advantage that is deeper than talent. They are not constantly surrendering the steering wheel of their life to novelty. They are not rebuilding their focus from zero every day. They are not teaching their mind that every slight discomfort deserves interruption. They are becoming harder to pull away from themselves. And that is one of the most valuable things a human being can become. You can feel this in simple moments. Sitting down to do something important and feeling a restless need to check something first. Reaching for stimulation the moment clarity asks for stillness. Breaking concentration not because the task is impossible, but because remaining with it feels too plain, too slow, too unadorned. None of this looks catastrophic, but repeated enough, it reshapes the self. This is what people miss when they treat distraction as harmless. Harmless things do not keep you from meeting your own depth. Harmless things do not steadily reduce your ability to be with difficulty. Harmless things do not make your mind more fragile, more dependent on stimulation, more resistant to silence, more easily owned by whatever is new. A distracted life is expensive because it creates internal shallowness, and internal shallowness is dangerous because it can still look intelligent from the outside. You can still sound sharp. You can still speak well. You can still know many things. You can still appear informed, insightful, even ambitious. But inside, your powers are not gathering, they are dispersing. Your attention is not maturing, it is fragmenting. And a fragmented mind has a very hard time producing a coherent life. That leads to another problem that is even more unsettling. Sometimes the life being built is not even one you truly want. This is where things get uncomfortable, because many people never stop long enough to ask whether their effort belongs to them. They ask whether they are progressing. They ask whether they are falling behind. They ask whether they are doing enough. But they never ask a more dangerous question. Enough for what? Progress toward what? Behind whom? Doing enough according to whose standard? It is possible to become highly active inside a borrowed life. A borrowed life can still look admirable. It can still be efficient, disciplined, productive, respectable. Other people may even praise it. But inwardly, it feels strangely empty, because activity and alignment are not the same thing. Movement alone proves nothing. A person can be moving fast in the wrong direction for years and call it ambition. This happens more often than people admit, because borrowed goals rarely arrive wearing that name. They arrive as common sense, as expectation, as the next obvious step, as what successful people do, as what family respects. as what sounds impressive, as what makes explanation easier, as what helps you feel safe from judgment. And because these pressures are so ordinary, a person can organize an entire life around them without ever consciously choosing them. Then one day they feel tired in a way rest cannot solve. Not because they are doing too much, but because they are giving themselves to something that does not feel inwardly true. Their effort is real, but the center is missing. Their schedule is full, but their life does not feel like their own. They keep moving, but the movement does not create peace. It only creates maintenance. They are performing a version of adulthood, competence, or success that looks coherent from the outside, while something deeper remains unconvinced. That creates a quiet emptiness that is hard to explain. Because on paper, things may look respectable. The person is not doing nothing. They are not collapsed. They are not obviously wasting their life in the dramatic sense. But inside, there is a low-grade deadness. A lack of meaningful connection to what all this effort is serving. And without that connection, discipline becomes harder to sustain cleanly. Resentment starts creeping in. Distraction becomes more attractive. Delay becomes easier to justify. Comfort regains power, not because the person is weak, but because the life itself is not rooted deeply enough in something chosen. This is why alignment matters more than image. Image can motivate for a while. Fear can motivate for a while. Comparison can motivate for a while. Proving people wrong can motivate for a while. Trying to outrun shame can motivate for a while. But these forms of fuel are unstable. They create movement without peace. They create effort without belonging. They can drive a person hard while quietly severing them from their own center. And once that severing happens, success starts feeling strangely thin. You see this when someone keeps achieving things that should feel satisfying, yet the satisfaction fades quickly. They reach the target, then immediately need another one. They stay restless even while progressing. They stay anxious even while performing. They keep doing what is supposed to matter, yet some part of them remains unconvinced. That is often not a discipline problem. It is an ownership problem. The life being built does not feel fully inhabited. A person must eventually ask, is this path actually mine, or is it simply the most socially acceptable version of effort available to me? That question can disturb an entire identity, because if the answer is painful, then more work is not the solution. More speed is not the solution. More optimization is not the solution. First, there has to be honesty, honest recognition of what has been chosen freely, what has been inherited unconsciously, what has been pursued to impress, what has been pursued to belong, and what has been pursued because stopping long enough to question it felt too risky. That kind of honesty is not comfortable, but without it, a person may become more efficient at building a life they do not truly want. And that is one of the saddest forms of waste, not failure. Misalignment dressed as achievement. Once you see that, another truth becomes impossible to avoid. What you tolerate is slowly becoming your life. This is how identity hardens, not through big statements, but through repeated allowances. What you accept in your habits, what you accept in your standards, what you accept in your environment, what you accept in your excuses, what you accept in the way you spend your mornings, your evenings, your attention, your strength. All of it is teaching you what kind of life is normal, and what becomes normal becomes powerful. Because once something is normalized, it no longer feels like a decision. It feels like reality. A low standard repeated long enough stops feeling low. Chronic distraction repeated long enough stops feeling dangerous. Broken promises to yourself repeated long enough stop feeling like betrayal. Emotional negotiation repeated long enough starts sounding like wisdom. This is how people get trapped. Not because they chose a bad life clearly and consciously, but because they tolerated small forms of weakness until those weaknesses became structure. Tolerance is never passive, it is formative. It shapes what you notice, what you resist, what you excuse, what you expect, what you think is possible for you. If you keep tolerating shallow days, shallow becomes familiar. If you keep tolerating self-betrayal, self-betrayal becomes less painful. If you keep tolerating confusion, drift starts sounding normal. If you keep tolerating a life that keeps pulling you away from your own standards, eventually the standards themselves begin to dissolve. That is why change is not only about adding better actions, it is also about becoming less available to what degrades you, less available to excuses that once sounded intelligent, less available to comforts that leave you weaker, less available to environments that flatten your attention, less available to goals that impress others, but empty you out, less available to standards you have already outgrown. This is the real pressure point, because life does not only improve when you become more ambitious, it improves when certain things stop feeling acceptable to you, when waste starts irritating you more deeply, when false progress stops satisfying you, when distraction begins to feel expensive instead of harmless, when self-betrayal starts becoming harder to digest, when borrowed goals lose their charm, when your relationship with your own time, energy and mind becomes serious enough that you can no longer live casually without noticing the cost. And once that threshold is crossed, the whole logic of change begins shifting. Because now the question is no longer how to get motivated. It is how much longer you are willing to keep living beneath what you already know. That is where everything starts. Not when you become inspired, not when life becomes clearer, not when the fear disappears. It starts when waste begins to disgust you. That is the moment people usually misunderstand. They think change begins when a person discovers a better plan, a better method, a better routine, a better system. Sometimes those things help. But most lives do not change at the level of information. They change at the level of tolerance. A person transforms when they can no longer calmly live with what has been draining them, when the old way stops feeling manageable, when wasted time stops feeling casual, when misalignment stops feeling ordinary, when self-betrayal stops sounding understandable and starts sounding costly. Until that shift happens, almost everything remains negotiable. You can hear a truth and admire it without obeying it. You can feel regret and still repeat yourself tomorrow. You can become emotional about your future and still protect every habit that keeps that future from arriving. Human beings are very capable of grieving the consequences of a life they are still quietly cooperating with. That is the real problem. Not ignorance, cooperation. Cooperation with distraction, cooperation with delay, cooperation with empty comfort, cooperation with borrowed goals, cooperation with standards that are too low for the life you claim to want. This is why people can spend years saying they want change while continuing to feed the structure that produces the same result. They are not lying exactly. They do want a different life. But wanting a different life is not enough if part of you is still loyal to what keeps you small. That loyalty has to break, and it usually breaks in a very private way, not in a dramatic scene, not in some cinematic breakthrough. More often it happens in a quiet moment when you finally see the pattern without decorating it. You see how much of your life has been spent waiting to feel different before behaving differently. You see how often you called fear caution, called avoidance rest, called confusion complexity, called delay preparation. You see how many days were lost, not because you were incapable, but because you kept granting softness the authority to decide what your life would become. That realization hurts. But it is useful pain, clean pain, because once waste becomes visible in that way, it becomes harder to romanticize your patterns, harder to keep talking about your potential as though it deserves respect on its own. Harder to keep telling yourself that later will save what now continues to damage. Harder to keep pretending that the life being built by your daily choices is somehow separate from the one you say you want. It is not separate. The life you want and the life you are reinforcing are either moving toward each other or away from each other. There is no neutral distance for very long. A person cannot keep betraying what matters and still expect self-respect to remain untouched. A person cannot keep scattering their attention and still expect depth to appear. A person cannot keep lowering standards in private and still expect power in public. Everything connects. That is the hard news. And it is also the good news. Because if everything connects, then small changes are not small in the way they seem. A cleaner morning is not just a cleaner morning. It is a vote against drift. Finishing what you said you would finish is not just task completion. It is evidence. Sitting with discomfort instead of escaping it is not just restraint. It is identity work. Refusing one more unnecessary distraction is not just discipline. It is a declaration about what gets access to your life. This is where change becomes real, not in grand promises, but in new refusals. Refusal to keep speaking about yourself in future tense while protecting present habits that keep you weak. Refusal to keep confusing desire with devotion. Refusal to keep building a life around what is easiest to explain rather than what feels deeply right. Refusal to keep living in such a way that your private actions steadily make your own ambitions sound less believable. Once these refusals become sincere, a different kind of energy appears. Not hype, not emotional intensity, something better. Weight. You begin to feel the weight of your own life again, the seriousness of a finite existence, the cost of repetition, the reality that days are not abstract units you can keep spending carelessly and somehow recover later. This is where many people wake up too late, not because they were stupid, but because time passes quietly when you are living on autopilot. One soft season becomes a year, 1 year becomes several. And eventually a person looks back and realizes the damage was not done by one catastrophe. It was done by the normalization of waste. That is why this confrontation matters now. Because life is more forgiving than people think in some ways, but less forgiving in another. You can begin late. You can recover from confusion. You can rebuild after years of weakness. You can return from distraction. You can become honest after self-deception. You can change far more than your past would suggest. But you cannot keep spending years the same way and expect their meaning to change on its own. At some point, a line has to be drawn, not a dramatic line for performance, a real one. A line that says, this pattern does not get to become my identity. This level of drift does not get to become my normal. This version of comfort does not get to keep feeding on my future. This style of self-betrayal does not get to keep wearing the mask of compassion. This relationship with time, attention, and effort does not get to continue pretending it is harmless. That line is where dignity returns. Because dignity is not only an achievement, it is in refusal. In the quiet refusal to continue participating in your own diminishment. In the refusal to keep making yourself smaller in ways no one else can fully see. In the refusal to stay loyal to patterns that have already shown you their price. And once that refusal is real, potential stops being fantasy. It begins becoming obligation. Not the heavy, joyless kind, the clarifying kind. The kind that says, if something real has been placed in you, then it is not enough to admire it. Talk about it, protect it, or wait for it. It has to be used, tested, organized, pressured, brought into the world through work that is often repetitive and invisible before it becomes meaningful and visible. Potential is not honored by being believed in. It is honored by being spent well. That is the difference between a person who keeps dreaming about another life and a person who is finally entering it. One stays emotionally attached to possibility. The other begins accepting the cost of embodiment. And embodiment is never glamorous at first. It asks for structure when emotion is absent. It asks for action before certainty. It asks for repetition before reward. It asks you to stop treating your moods as authorities and start treating them as passing weather. It asks you to become trustworthy to yourself in ways that do not impress anyone immediately. It asks you to build substance before image. That is why so few people do it seriously, not because they are incapable, but because the early stages of real change do not flatter the ego. You are not yet who you want to be. The work is not yet beautiful. The results are not yet obvious. The discipline still feels effortful. The mind still protests. The old patterns still call your name. And yet this is the exact place where a life turns, not when it looks impressive, but when it becomes honest. You begin again. You keep your word in smaller places. You protect your attention more fiercely. You stop calling confusion depth. You stop calling comfort peace. You stop calling delay thoughtfulness. You stop calling borrowed ambition success. You strip the lies of their elegance. You become simpler, cleaner, more exact. And then something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Your life starts feeling more expensive to waste. That feeling changes everything. Because once your time becomes expensive to you, your choices sharpen. Once your attention becomes expensive to you, distraction loses some of its seduction. Once your self-respect becomes expensive to you, self-betrayal stops feeling casually survivable. Once your future becomes expensive to you, your standards rise naturally. You no longer need endless motivation because the deeper issue is no longer mood. The deeper issue is that you see more clearly what things cost. Clarity changes appetite. You stop craving what weakens you quite so easily. You stop envying lives you do not actually want. You stop admiring forms of ease that quietly rot discipline. You stop speaking about transformation as though it's a personality type reserved for other people. It becomes a matter of relationship. What are you willing to keep feeding? What are you willing to keep allowing? What are you finally unwilling to keep paying for? That is the real opening, not the opening of a magical new chapter, but the opening of seriousness, the opening of a life that is no longer being lived casually from the inside, the opening of an identity that is no longer built around excuses that sound intelligent, the opening of a future shaped less by fantasy and more by repeated acts of private alignment. And that is enough, more than enough. Because a wasted life is usually not corrected through one explosive act of reinvention. It is corrected through a change in what you will and will not continue permitting, through a change in what gets your attention, through a change in whether your actions keep agreeing with your deeper knowledge, through a change in whether you keep protecting the part of you that wants comfort more than truth. So if something in you already knows that time has been slipping, that strength has been scattering, that the gap between who you could be and how you have been living has become too wide to ignore, then do not reduce that knowledge into a passing emotional moment. Do not turn it into another brief encounter with self-awareness that changes nothing by tomorrow. Let it become a line. A clean line, not everything at once, but something real, something honest, something repeated, something that begins closing the gap between what you know and how you live. Because your life is always becoming something, the question is whether that becoming is conscious or whether it is being handed over to comfort, fear, noise, and drift. There is still time to answer that question well, but not by continuing in the same spirit, not by waiting to feel transformed first, not by admiring your potential from a distance, by becoming harder to waste.